The idea of using vintage baseball cards as a legitimate tool in your investment portfolio is a fairly recent one. Even within the hobby, there remains a level of skepticism about whether vintage baseball cards are truly good long-term investments. The single biggest criticism you hear from collectors is the belief that the value of baseball cards bottom out during times of economic recession. This long-held idea probably started at the end of the junk wax era, when collectors saw their cards depreciate to pennies on the dollar due to overproduction and speculation. On the other side, you have people like card consignment giant PWCC touting vintage baseball cards as a legitimate tradable asset class. They say their index of the top 100 cards has outperformed the stock market 2-to-1 since 2006. One way to test whether cards are a legitimate investment is to examine what happened to their value during the Great Recession. There is a large volume of sales data that is available for free on the internet that makes this possible. This study looks at 20 different vintage baseball cards and examines what happened to their values before, during, and after the Great Recession. Over 4,500 sales transactions were examined between 2005 and 2015, more than enough for clear patterns to emerge. There is consensus among economists that the Great Recession started in December 2007 and lasted until June 2009. Full recovery from the economic losses of the recession took much longer, however. To give context, the stock market lost 50% of its value and took 6 years to recover fully from the 2008 lows. In the housing market, about 50% of homeowner equity was wiped out, and it took 8 years, until 2016, to recover those losses. For the labor market, the unemployment rate doubled from 5 to 10%, and it took 6 years for it to recover. To summarize, because of the Great Recession, the overall U.S. economy lost about half its value, and it took anywhere from 6 to 8 years to recover. If it's true that vintage baseball cards suffer big losses during economic downturns, then we should expect to see similar drops in value for cards too. First, let's look at what happened to some top-tier cards. These are vintage cards at the highest level of the hobby, cards in high grades that are in strong demand by serious collectors. In this class, we have cards like the T206 Ty Cobb, the 1933 Gowdy Babe Ruth, the 1957 Mantle, 1952 Jackie Robinson, and the rookie cards of Willie Mays, Roberto Clemente, Hank Aaron, Sandy Koufax, and Pete Rose. Let's look first at the Ruth and Cobb cards. To make the comparisons equal, we are going to look at the percentage of value that the cards rose or fell year to year. For these cards, their lowest value was in 2010, technically after the recession was over. Note that their value never dropped below 2005 numbers. By 2013, each card had overcome any losses and surpassed their previous highs in 2006. These cards took 3 years to recover and then showed strong growth in the years after the recession. Next, let's examine what happened to some cards from the 1950s from Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, and Jackie Robinson. Here we can get some variation between the Mantle card and the others. Mays and Robinson cards actually have declines before the recession. Their cards do take a hit in the recession, losing values in 2010, but they rebounded within a year and continued to post strong growth afterwards. The Mantle card seems more steady, never losing value below its 2005 level, but taking longer to surpass its pre-recession value. Perhaps this is because the 1957 Mantle is not the most in-demand Mantle card in the hobby. Let's look next at high-grade examples of the rookie cards of Hank Aaron, Roberto Clemente, Sandy Koufax, and Pete Rose. The outliers here seem to be Sandy Koufax and Roberto Clemente. Koufax's card seems barely impacted by the recession. The several years of declines were more than made up for by the years where the growth was in double digits. The average value of a 1955 Koufax in a PSA 8 was $1,341 in 2005. By 2015, it was $4,230. Clemente's card took a big hit in 2009, dropping 46%. It took 3 years to recover, but then also started increasing in value at a high rate. From 2005 to 2015, the value of the PSA 7 Clemente rookie went up 212%. The Aaron and Rose rookie cards were barely impacted by the recession. Their values never got below 2005 levels, and any drops between 2010 and 2011 were regained in only about a year. From 2013 on, each card had double-digit yearly growth. Now, let's take a look at how all 9 cards did between 2005 and 2015. Through all the lines of the graph, you can make out a pattern, but it's more obvious if we average all the data. In this next graph, we can see a couple surprising facts. Card values were at a high in 2008, which is technically during the time period of the Great Recession. In 2009 and 2010, values flattened. They dropped during the time when technically, according to economists, the Great Recession was over. By 2011, a period of only about 2.5 years, all of these losses had been reversed. It's important to note that the cards never lost a lot of value. Only 2 of the 9 cards went below 2005 levels. If anything, the Great Recession seemed to be just a delay in what would become explosive double-digit growth each year between 2012 and 2015. Let's switch to examining what happened to cards that are a little more accessible to the average collector. Here, sales data for some well-known but high-grade cards from the 1960s and 70s is analyzed. Let's take a look at the Nolan Ryan Rookie in an 8 and the 1971 Munson in a 7. Both cards have a similar curve on the graph. They take a pre-recession dip in 2006, climb in value through 2008, but then drop in 2009, after the recession was technically over. It takes each card about 3 years to regain the value it had in that 2008 high. The Ryan card in particular just keeps growing from 2009 on, hitting explosive levels starting in 2013. The Munson card is more subject to yearly fluctuation. Next, we'll look at PSA 8 graded examples of the rookie cards of Joe Morgan, Reggie Jackson, and George Brett. The value of these cards between 2005 and 2015 also follow a similar pattern. They drop in 2006, before the recession, and take more losses in 2009. They need 2 years to go back to 2005 levels. But after that, they also show this explosive double-digit growth in their value each year. If we chart a line graph of the average percent change in value of all 5 cards, we see that the Great Recession had about 2.5 years of impact on the sales prices of these cards. The drops in value were more intense than we saw with the top-tier cards, but within 3 years, these cards were also showing complete recovery and very aggressive yearly growth. Think back to the impact of the Great Recession on the stock market, housing, and labor markets. Those losses were approximately 50% of the total value and took anywhere between 6 and 9 years to recover. In comparison, the impact of the Great Recession on these vintage baseball cards is of much lower duration and much less intensity. Let's look at one more group of cards. These 6 are what I call value cards. Most cost well under $100, and they are not particularly sought after by collectors, but they are good, solid Hall of Fame players. Examining all 6 cards charted out on the same graph, we can see some differences. The 1967 Steve Carlton does not weather the Great Recession as well as the 1962 Frank Robinson. Now we'll put all the cards together, averaging their performance between 2005 and 2015. We can see that of all the groups of cards that we've examined so far, these value cards seem most impacted by the recession. They are the only group to see their 2010 value drop below their 2005 value. But, like the other groups of cards, these cards recover from the recession relatively quickly by 2011. Unlike the other groups, their growth is short-lived. Their value drops again in 2015 for reasons that aren't immediately clear. By examining the value of vintage baseball cards before, during, and after the Great Recession, some obvious patterns emerge. The Great Recession did have a negative impact on value on almost all the vintage baseball cards that were examined. But some cards were more impacted than others. Cards at the highest end of the hobby, the top-tier collector cards, saw much less movement in their value. Some of these cards barely lost any value, or at worst, were flat in their growth. As we move down the scale into cards that are at the middle or lower ends of collectability, we see the recession having more of an impact. Another thing is also clear. It didn't take long for vintage baseball cards to recoup their losses and then begin a period of explosive growth. Within 2 to 3 years, almost all the cards were back on track and experiencing double-digit annual growth. It's safe to say that the common fear among collectors that values of vintage baseball cards will bottom out during an economic downturn is vastly over-exaggerated. The data seems to suggest the opposite, that some baseball cards are actually more resistant to bad economic times than other assets. The higher collectability of the card, the more resistant it is. If you are not already investing in vintage baseball cards, what's stopping you? If you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please drop them below. I've also listed the methodology I use for this study in the description box below. Thanks for watching.